Hello. So today I'm going to share with you my story about how I was called to the shamanic path. And this is really intended for those of you who have maybe thought before about, is shamanic training meant for me and what does it look like? And so I want to share with you what called me to the shamanic path. And also, even if you are like, nah, I know I don't ever want to do a full shamanic training, but I want to understand like why someone might go through the training and the trouble and the energy to become a shaman. Um, like what calls them to that. So I think I'm just going to take a moment first and introduce myself if you've never watched or anything of mine before, or listened to any of my podcasts, or know anything about me. So, my name is Shannon, and I am an Earth Akashic healer. So, Earth Akashic healing is a form of working in the 23rd plus dimensions of the Akashic records. So, like really, really high dimensional. That was shared with me when I was healing myself from Lyme disease. And this process is a huge integral part to how I healed. So I call it Earth Akashic healing because it's very shamanic based as well. So I'm an Earth Akashic healer, and I am an Earth and Star trained contemporary shaman. Which, what does that mean? So shamanic work is earth work. It's human work. It's like working with humans, working with souls, working with earth, working with nature, working with animals, like working with this planet we live on. So that's traditional shamanic work. I also work with the stars. I work in other planets, on other dimensions. I do a lot of journeying out of this galaxy and out of what we can visibly see. So that's star shamanic work. So I am trained in both, and I do a lot of work in both aspects of shamanism. So when I say I'm a contemporary shaman, what I mean by that is that I was trained in an ancient lineage of shamanic, specifically Celtic, with some Norse shamanic influences in there as well. That's my ancestry. So I was trained in that ancestral way. I was trained in an ancient lineage. It's been passed down from woman to woman for a long, long time. And so I was trained in the traditional ways of working as a shaman, doing shamanic work. And because we no longer live in the ways that we did when shamanic work was first found, we lived in tribes, we lived in villages, we lived in small communities, and now we live in this global world. We're connected all over. So many of my clients don't even live in the same state as me or same country. So I was trained in contemporary shamanism, which is kind of essentially the idea of updating all of those traditional practices to make them applicable to real world where we still have to live in society. We have created these societies, all of these constructs that are how we live now. We have to live in that. I don't get to hide away from that and not live in it just because I'm trained in shamanic work. And so contemporary shamanism is really about being trained in the ancient traditional techniques and then trained into how to live in today's world and offer this shamanic healing and shamanic work in ways that will be beneficial to everyone, right? Because it's not beneficial to try and live as a shaman who is, only trained on how to work in a small village, which is, again, traditional ancient shamanic techniques. So that's what I mean by contemporary shamanism. And it's basically a big part of my training was about how is this work useful here and now? We can see how it would have been useful 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or even longer, but how is it useful now, and how do I do it now, and how do I help people in the world we live in now, because it's not the world that we lived in 1,500 years ago. So that's contemporary shamanism in a nutshell, essentially. So that's who I am. And what I was going to answer today, or what I'm going to talk about today, is what called me to the shamanic path. So the shamanic path, it's the most ancient or I would say it's one of the most ancient spiritual healing paths. Um, there are stories of shamans and shamanic techniques, going so far back in history. Um, and the really cool, interesting thing, if you didn't know this, is that the word shaman really originates from, it's like has European origins. So when I first started looking into shamanic studies, I wasn't sure what word to use because I'm not, I'm American, but I'm not Native American, and so I didn't want to be appropriating like that, and I wasn't looking for that a Native American teacher because it's not my culture. I was looking for a Celtic shamanic teacher, and something I learned is that shaman is really the word used for the European traditions, and the closest like English translation from what I've learned and been told for more indigenous traditions is like medicine man or medicine woman. So that was really interesting to me because I was like scared of using the word shaman until I understood that the word actually has roots in the cultures that I'm from. So I was like, okay, cool. I can use this energy then. I can use this name. Um, so it was a calling for me. I had this feeling that I was going to need to find shamanic work without really understanding at all what it was for a few years. Like it was something that came in, and it really came in because of past life visions I had. And the closest word I could put to what I was seeing of these versions of self was shaman. And I didn't really know what that meant, and I knew I wasn't ready to know what it meant yet. So I spent a couple years like knowing that it was going to be in my life eventually, but not really being too worried about finding it. And then I started my business, and a few months into it, I was doing Akashic work only. And a few months into having started my business, I was like, okay, I love the Akashic work, but the shamanic work is calling. Like I am hearing that call so deeply. It was like in my dreams. It was in Akashic journeys I did. It was always coming up, shaman, shaman, shaman. And finally, I was like, okay, I can't ignore this any longer. I have to find a shamanic teacher. And I basically like Googled Celtic shamanic training, and several results came up, but a lot of them were like big school or not, like schools and such. And it was like you could enroll in online classes or things, and I was like, that's not the thing. That's not it. I had this intuitive knowing, which I later learned why, which I'll get to, that I needed way more than an online class. I was like, that's not enough. That is not the kind of shamanic work I'm looking for, which is so interesting. Um, and then a website popped up, and it was the website of the woman who became my teacher. And it was just this knowing. I saw it and I was like, oh, that's her. So I sent her an email, and we got on some Zoom calls and chatted, and she told me more about what I was getting myself into, but also not all about what I was getting myself into, because you really just like can't describe what a shamanic apprenticeship is like until you do it. And then once you do it, you're like, okay, I get it, but there's not words for it. Like, there just aren't words for what a shamanic apprenticeship or training is like, unless or until you do it. I'll try and explain it, but it is pretty inexplainable, honestly. Um, so I found my teacher, and we decided to start working together. And for me, it was just, again, it was a knowing. I like knew I had to do this. I knew this was the next part of my work, the next level, the next phase. Like it was just like there's not a choice. It wasn't even a second guessing, really. Um, and I was in a place where truly everything had fallen away from me, and financially I really didn't have any money, and I committed to this container going, I have literally, quite literally, no idea how I will pay for this, but I know I'm going to be able to. And I had zero issue being able to. I always got the money I needed before I needed to make payments, and it was really beautiful how that worked. But it was, again, it was just this knowing. I was like, okay, I have to find this person. And I met her. I was like, that's her. That's who has to teach me. That's the person. And it was just so known, so clear. And it became so clear to me as well why I didn't want to do any of the like online training things where it was like, oh, get on like our platform and you can just do self-guided courses, because that is not how you learn shamanic work. Like it can introduce you to it, but you cannot become a shamanic practitioner or a shaman by doing that work. Like you just can't. And so this is really interesting because there's a lot of spiritual things that we can self-teach. There's the potential. Like my akashic work, totally self-taught. I never learned from anyone else. I looked at some people's programs and I just couldn't resonate with them, and so I just followed what I was receiving and channeling, and it makes sense because I work at a different dimension and layers of the akashic field than almost anyone else in the world. And so it makes sense that I couldn't be taught, because it's new. However, shamanic work is not new. These are ancient traditional practices. They have to be passed down. You can't just do it yourself. You need a teacher who's passing it down to you. Otherwise, you might understand some of the like basic concepts, and you might be able to use some of the basic concepts, but you're not a shamanic trained practitioner, because if you haven't actually been taught, like had it passed down to you, excuse me, if you haven't had it passed down to you, then you haven't really like been given it. And shamanic work is something that you're like kind of given. It's like a gift. Like, okay, yes, I see that you are someone who is meant to learn this, and I'm going to gift to you what I've learned and what I know, and I'm going to teach you. Like that's what the relationship between teacher and apprentice is often. So that's why I saw these other courses that are like self-guided online, and I was like, I can't do that. And I just had this intuitive knowing without actually really understanding shamanic work or shamanism at that point, in this life. I just knew I need this passed down to me for somebody else. And shamanic work is very specific in that way. It's very special in that way, you could say, because again, it really is about passing down the traditional understandings and teachings, and you need a teacher for that. It just, you do, you know? So we started this work. I started my apprenticeship, and it was the most intense experience. So quickly, things started to fall away in my life. That's the essence of a shamanic apprenticeship. A shamanic apprenticeship is always going to involve death. It doesn't always mean physical death, but it does mean some kind of energetic death, losing things, having things shift in your reality. Shamanic death is a thing, and shamanic deaths happening in your apprenticeship are an indication that you are on the right path. If someone went through an apprenticeship without a death of any kind, then that's a pretty good indication that that person is not meant to do shamanic work. And that's totally fine. Not everyone is meant to do shamanic work. So death just happened over and over and over. There is so much shifting, so much change in my life. Relationships fell away, old ideas and ways of being fell away. I mean, it was insane. And I did experience loss of some people in the family circle. There were a couple of deaths that happened in my like physical reality, and I lost my cat, who had really been my everything for my entire life. She was my childhood cat, and she came to me and asked to go. She got very sick, a few months into my apprenticeship. She'd been sick, but she'd been like stable, and then it just totally, she got very, very sick, and she asked to be let go about halfway through my apprenticeship. So there was physical death as well. And I also went through more physical shamanic death when I had my whole Lyme disease journey, which if you're brand new to my stuff, there's a lot of stuff you can find in past blog posts and podcasts and things about my journey with Lyme disease, but that's really what brought me to my spiritual path. Because I almost died when I was sick, and so I kind of had my first shamanic initiation then without even knowing that it was a shamanic initiation, which is pretty interesting. So anyway, so all of that, all of those things shifted. So many things fell away. And it just, even within that, I knew I was in the right place. I really am good at death medicine. I'm really good at what I mean by that is like I'm really good at working with things that are difficult. I'm really good at looking at shadow stuff. I'm really good at like being able to do that and not be scared away by it, you know? And so shamanic work was really just, it was right for me. And my shamanic work then was able to deepen my akashic work. So that's why my akashic work, I call it earth akashic healing, because there's a huge shamanic influence to it, which I really love. I think it's so beautiful to be able to balance the cosmic akashic work with this really grounded, beautiful shamanic work. And then I do a lot of womb work as well, which is both akashic and shamanic, and they get to really meld together using ancient like womb shamanism practices, using ancient womb shamanism, you know, knowledge, and using the akasha work I know how to do and that I really love to do, and mixing them together. So it's really beautiful. So yeah, that's how I got called to my shamanic path. I really never doubted it. I just knew it was going to happen. I just didn't know when. And then when I was told it's now, I had zero clue how I was going to make it work. I literally found my teacher and then moved from France back to the US like a few weeks later. So I was in this massive period of transition, really rethinking my entire life. Like I had never expected to live in the US again. I'd planned to stay in Europe. It was right during COVID, like 2020, and it was intense. It was a big everything in my life changed, and it would have been a lot easier to say, okay, you know what, it's not the time for an apprenticeship. I should work on the other stuff right now, and then I'll come back to this later. But it was just such a clear no, you do the apprenticeship when everything's changing, because shamanic work is about embracing the chaos and the unknown and the change. And so I did, and I have never regretted it. And I then a few months ago was asked by Spirit to start teaching shamanic work, which is much sooner than I ever expected to be asked to teach. But I've been doing this for so many lifetimes that I was asked to teach really soon into my journey, in a human, like time-wise way. And so I'm teaching apprentices right now who are just blowing me away, honestly, with their work. It's so incredible. Anyway, that is my shamanic journey in a nutshell, how I got called to it, how I knew it was for me. So if you're feeling kind of maybe called to shamanic work and you're like, interested, but maybe not sure or nervous or scared, or just want more information, like drop some questions in the comments, send me an email, connect with me on Instagram. Let's talk about it. Like, let's talk about what are your questions about shamanism? What are your questions about the path? If you're being called to it, what are your questions about how it looks like? And if you have more questions about how it impacts your life, I'd be happy to answer and talk about it. This is the most beautiful journey ever, and I'd love to help if this is something you're feeling called to. All right, thanks for being here with me. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.